right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started here. A couple minutes after 1 p.m. Eastern. Thank you for joining us. Hello and welcome to another SACE webinar. Today, we're going to talk through some trends that we saw when we looked at 20 years of historical hourly load data across the Southeast utilities. I am Maggie Schober. I lead our technical team at SACE out of our Knoxville office. Well, for now, out of my home in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I am joined today by an illustrious SACE alum and now research director for Resource Insight, John Wilson. So for a little logistics before we get started, everyone should be automatically muted now, and we'll keep you muted throughout the presentation. But if you do have questions, and we hope you do, please enter those through the chat box on the screen. We have planned for plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, and so we'll be going through those at that point. All right, so just starting out with a little bit about SACE. For anyone who's not familiar, we're a nonprofit. We have staff all across the Southeast. We advocate for and promote clean energy choices for healthier and safer communities, and have been a leading voice for clean energy policy in the Southeast for decades now. So let's get into the topic of the day, electricity demand. So when we look at annual electricity demand in the Southeast, we see very different trends for different utilities. Here are some of the starker contrasts in the Southeast, where we have utilities like Florida Power and Light, Duke Energy Carolinas, Orlando and Lakeland, all growing at more than 1.5% annually. But we also have utilities like TVA, Santee Cooper, Seminole, and Mississippi Power that have flat or declining annual demand growth. So quite the variety there. Note that these are trends that are starting in 2012, so don't include the Great Recession where a number of utilities saw demand contract. But we wanted to know, okay, these are some trends, but what about peak load? We wanted to see if peak trends matched up with what we've been seeing in annual demand. So we took a closer look. And what we saw was the overall regional demand shows that peak load has been in decline since at least 2010. This trend is observed when we compile an hourly load data set across the entire region. So some individual utilities can and do show different trends than the regional data, and we'll get to those later on in the presentation. Other major observations from the regional data are that the Southeast appears to be a dual peaking region. What do we mean by that? Well, there isn't a set definition for what it means for a region or a utility to be either winter peaking or summer peaking. So we used 3 different measures to classify both the region and utilities as either summer peaking, winter peaking, or dual peaking. And those metrics are the number of winter peak hours, the number of winter peak events, and a 7-year ratio of winter to summer peaks, looking at the latest 7 years in the data. So that ratio, for instance, if the winter peak was 900 megawatts and the summer peak was 1,000 megawatts, that ratio would be 90%. So at the regional level, we see a shift from summer peaking to dual peaking because summer peaks have declined over the 20-year study period, while winter peaks have been flat, and that has led to a convergence between the two at the regional level. But before we go further, I do want to give a bit more background on why peak demand is important to look at and how we went about analyzing it in this study. So utility forecasts of peak demands are a key part of utility future resource planning. Peak forecasts drive utility decisions on what kinds of infrastructure to build, how much generation is needed, and when it is needed. Reliability metrics require utilities to be able to handle a certain percentage of demand above the expected peak, called a reserve margin, and also the number of the expected duration of peak events can stress transmission and distribution equipment, so drive the need for utilities to invest in infrastructure as well. So these are a few of the main reasons why we care what's happening with peak. Let me clarify briefly how we define peak load for this report. So what we did not use is, we didn't use the utilities designation of peak events for purposes of either like peak pricing or demand response. Those can vary from utility to utility, how they define those. We also didn't select the highest load hour or set number of hours in each year of the data set, as that would tend to either underrepresent years where demand was peakier or overrepresent demand where years where demand was flatter. So what we decided to do for how we decided to define a peak event is a series of consecutive or nearly consecutive hours with a system load factor in the top 1.1% over the entire 20-year data set. So we looked at every hour in all 20 years and took out the top 1.1%. And let me also define what I mean by load factor here. So when we say load factor, we are comparing the actual peak to the forecasted peak from the prior year's forecast. Just a quick example to explain that. If we have an hour in 2012 where load was 950 megawatts and the forecasted peak for 2012 that was released in 2011 expected a peak of 1,000 megawatts, then we define that hour as having a system load factor of 95%, 950 over 1,000. So I have one more background slide where I'm going to show the geographical coverage of the data analyzed in this study, and then we're going to dive deeper into the trends that we observed. So the data in this study are from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and are based on planning authorities designated by FERC. These planning authorities can include more than one utility, and you can see on the map how those are defined. You can also see that the map, the data cover a number of states, all of Alabama, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and most of North Carolina and Tennessee, as well as parts of Mississippi, Kentucky, and one teeny tiny part of Virginia. So, all right, now we're ready to delve in a little deeper into the trends that we did and did not observe in the study, and I will turn it over to John Wilson.
Thanks, Matt. Great. Thanks everybody for joining us. We have a nice big crowd here, and happy to go through all these data. And I will try to watch the chat if there's any clarifying questions, if there's anything that Maggie or I share with you during the presentation that just needs a quick clarification. We'll try to address that in real time, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end. And as Maggie mentioned, what we focused on in this report was looking at the peak hours, that top 1% of load hours. And the first sort of finding we have is that most peak hours occur during the summer in the Southeast. And this is, again, this Southeast regional data set. And this is important to understand because even though the Southeast is a dual peaking region, the vast majority of the peak hours occur during the summer. So even when there is a winter peak event for a year, still most of the hours of the year where the utility system in the Southeast is at its maximum output occur during the summer. And so that's kind of our first finding. Second one is about winter peak hours. They're becoming more frequent. And that corresponds really not to a change in what's going on in the winter in terms of the behavior of the winter um, um, hours. And in fact, we found that there's really no indication that winter peak hours are becoming more common overall. But the actual peak event does occur more often, and that's because there's a narrowing gap between the summer and the winter peaks. Another point that's illustrated here is that the seasonal distribution of peak hours can differ among utilities. And what we've illustrated here is Duke Energy Carolinas, and you can see that, for example, in 2011, Duke Energy Carolinas had a lot of summer peak events, while the Southeast as a whole was on the relatively low end. And then you can look at another year like, say, 2005 or 6, and you can see that the Southeast had a lot of peak events, or peak hours, excuse me. But the Duke Energy Carolinas had fewer, relatively speaking. So you do see differences between utilities in the Southeast, and we're going to get into some more detail about how that works, but I wanted to kind of familiarize you with that concept. You can also see here the trends in the winter that they're picking up, but again, they're not uniform between a particular utility in the Southeast. Sometimes there's quite a few events at a utility and not in the Southeast, and potentially vice versa. Next trend I want to point out is that utilities are overestimating peak demand. And here we've got a history of the forecast peak for all the utilities in the Southeast added together compared to the actual peak, as you see there next to it. And you can see that on average, the forecast error over the 8 years that we've got included here on the graph is about 8%. But that has been improving over time, and it's been declining by about 1% a year. So utilities are beginning to improve their forecasts, but they haven't quite nailed it yet. And you wouldn't expect it to be perfect in any particular year because weather variability does kick in, but it is interesting that there's a pretty steady trend towards improvement. Across the Southeast, let's look at the individual utilities, and you can sort of pick out your favorite utility. And what we've done is we've got a ranking here in rough order from most winter peaking to most summer peaking in the Southeast. And I would not quibble too much with the exact ranking. Our metric that we use to rank them is based on real data, and we think it's a pretty good approach, but you could certainly tweak the ranking method and come up with a different order, and I couldn't argue with a different weighting of some of the factors we used. So it's really more of a rough order, but it will help you to kind of watch this over the next few slides. And we used 3 measures to classify the utilities. The first one, and Maggie already talked about this a little bit, is this ratio of maximum winter and summer peaks. And so what we do is we just look at the maximum during a 7-year period, and you see here 3 7-year periods illustrated. Our ranking only considers the most recent period, but you can see sort of a sense of trends here as well at some utilities. Sometimes they're kind of back and forth, and in other cases, the trend seems pretty steady across the 3 7-year time periods. So you can see here that at some utilities, you get winter peaks as much as 10 or 20% higher than the summer peak. And then likewise, sometimes you get summer peaks as high as 10 or 15% greater than the winter peak. So there can be some pretty big differences across the systems. And in the middle, you see the dual peaking utilities. Some of them on this metric show up as mainly winter peaking, but on other metrics, they'll show up more consistent with summer or dual peaking. Second metric we have here is the number of peak hours per season. So in this case, we're saying we take the top 1.1% of the load factor hours across the entire data set. And the question is, in what season do those hours occur? And so at some utilities, you'll see as many as 20 to 25% of the peak hours occur in the winter, while at other utilities, it's essentially almost 0% hours. And you'll note here that even though we have identified a number of winter peaking utilities, none of them have a majority of their peak hours occurring in the winter. They're all majority summer peaking hours. And then you'll see there the Southeast, the coincident data put it down at the very tail end here of the dual peaking utilities. So the Southeast is still very strongly dominated by summer peak events overall as a region, even though it does have a tendency to have some very strong winter peak hours occasionally. Next, we want to look at peak events, and it's hard to do a graph for this, so you'll have to bear with me with this table, and you can study it in the report if you're interested. But the percentage of peak events this is our third indicator, and what we defined as a peak event, as Maggie kind of went through up front, is the excuse me just a second, the screen just kind of messed up on me. Well, a peak event, we went through the data, and essentially in the summertime they're pretty easy. They pretty much all start and end on the same day. On the wintertime, sometimes they'll slip in and out of the peak event. So what we did was we said basically a peak event is peak hours strung together, and generally if there's a 1 hour where it slips below our peak our peak load threshold, we'll go ahead and put those two strings of hours together and call that a single peak event. So you will see a few hours in a long peak event that dip below the threshold, but not very much. And so that was how we defined peak event. So it required kind of a manual measurement. And you'll see here that the peak events still dominate mainly in the summer. By far, the majority of the peak events are in the summertime. Some of them are in the winter, and that particularly is the case for the winter peaking utilities, as you would expect. And you'll see here the average duration, and you can see that varies quite a bit. For the summertime peaks, the Southeast has an average duration of about 4.5 hours for a peak event. And that varies, you know, between maybe 3.5 and 5.5, give or take, hours across the utilities. So it's a pretty narrow range there for the average. But for the winter peak events, you see a much broader range where the Southeast is at 2.6, and there's some down as low as 2.3 hours. But then there's some utilities that have as high as 6.1 hours of average duration winter peak events. And I'll briefly mention about the shoulder events. We don't have very many events during the shoulder months, which are fall and spring hours that kind of fall in between. Most of those events could be pretty easily classified as either summer or winter events. If you went through and looked at them manually, you can see pretty much that they have characteristics that match one season or the other. But we didn't do that because it was computationally would have been very challenging to go through and make that manual classification. The other thing I'll mention here is we've got this category called long duration winter events, and we'll get into that in a few minutes, but I'll just point out here so that you're sort of prepped for that there's 4 utilities that tend to have these long duration winter events, and then a few others that have them very occasionally. And again, this is over a 20-year data set, so 10 long duration winter events means about 1 every 2 years. And I'm seeing some questions here, but I'm going to hold off on answering the ones that have come up because those are kind of policy questions as opposed to just clarifications. Great, so here's a little bit of a look at summer peak events. On the left, I picked Oglethorpe Power as just kind of a typical illustration of how summer peak loads work. And for those who are familiar with electric load, this won't be at all surprising. You've got sort of an average August day, and you can see that on a peak event day, the demand is heightened quite a bit throughout the day and kind of in a nice consistent shape. There's not a lot of variation from one peak event to the next. They all have very similar shapes. And over on the right, you'll see that I've grouped the utilities, the 22 utilities that we studied, into 2 groups. So in the black line, you see the Southeast region. That's the coincident load, and that's what the shape looks like overall. And that's where you see that 4.5 hour average duration sort of show up. And then I've broken out in the blue line, those are the 17 systems that are fairly typical. And then there were 5 systems that tended to have longer duration events. So they had fewer short duration events and a few more longer duration events. Nothing over 12 hours though, and very rarely over 8 hours even for that group of utilities. not anything in particular that characterized those, but those just tended to be unusual utilities, and we wanted to sort of flag what the level of diversity here is. So even for the most unusual utilities, they still look pretty similar to the rest of the group. Winter, however, shows a much different approach. First of all, on the left, you see an example from TVA, and here again is the top 10 events, but this time for the winter for a utility. And you can see that there's a fairly large variety in the pattern of those top 10 winter peak events. If we went deeper into the stack to the next, say, 30 or 40 top winter peak events, you'd see even more variety in the load shapes. So they can be very different. So they're not just sort of taking an average January day and sort of bumping it up, but the shape is different, and you know, the entry point and exit points can be quite different from each other. So you see a lot of differences from an average winter day to a winter peak event. The other thing you see here on the right is that the winter peak event duration also has a lot of variety among the different utilities. So here I've grouped the utilities into the three groups we talked about: the winter peaking systems, the dual peaking systems, and the summer peaking systems. And it should be no surprise that the summer peaking systems have very few winter peak events, and that they do tend to be very short, you know, 2, 3, maybe 4 hours in duration. The dual peaking systems tend to have winter peak events that run a little bit longer, maybe up to 5 or 6 hours typically. But it's the winter peaking systems that really have the vast majority of the winter peak events. And those systems tend to have maybe as many as, you know, 2 or 3 events per year of duration of maybe 2 to 4 hours, and then possibly an event that is much longer than that. And here's where these long duration winter peak events show up. And if you look over on the right, you'll see that these systems tended to have a very few, but still significant number of winter peak events of duration of 15 to 20, and even more than 20 hours in a few cases duration. And we'll get into an example of that here in just a second. Yeah, okay, so just glancing at the chat, I'm gonna keep rolling here. So I'm sorry, I forgot, I meant to highlight that here's the sort of kind of helping direct you to those long duration winter peak events. And here's a sort of a graphical representation of these long duration winter peak events. And we define these as events with more than 12 consecutive peak hours. It occurs mainly at these 4 utilities in the Southeast. And these systems tend to have more rural customers. Another comment that I've gotten since releasing the report was on the prevalence of or the lack of natural gas in residential and commercial applications in those regions, and that may be another explanatory factor, or it may be sort of the same thing as rural. So at any rate, you can sort of think about it as natural gas, lack of natural gas, it being rural. We really don't have a firm grip on the answer as to why these particular utilities have these events, but they are very distinct at those 4 utilities. There's 6 other utilities that sort of occasionally get them, 2 to 5 events over the past 20 years, but pretty rare. And also those tend to be a little bit shorter than the ones at these 4 utilities. And you can see on the graph, you've got the average January day kind of repeated over and over again, and you can see how varied these 8 long duration winter peak events at TVA are in terms of sort of the patterns that they follow. They all sort of peak during day 2. That's kind of by design in terms of how I selected the events to graphically represent here. And there's one that's sort of traced all the way through to kind of help you follow a particular event over the several days. So hopefully that's kind of an interesting and new way to look at these winter peak events. And again, these are fairly rare. Most of the events look more like single day events that we illustrated on a prior slide. Final thing that we looked at in this study was how individual utilities matched up to the regional peak. And what we did was we said, all right, for an individual utility, let's take TVA up in the top right. When it is peaking, is the rest of the is the region peaking? So on let's say August 5th of a particular year, TVA is peaking. Is the region also peaking? And in TVA's case, the answer is generally yes. In the wintertime, if TVA is peaking, the region is almost certainly peaking. And in the summer, it's very likely that TVA is peaking when the region is peaking. But you can see down on the bottom left that there's a number of Florida utilities that have very weak coincidence with the winter peak or the summer peak across the region. And then there's some utilities in the two quadrants, upper left and bottom right, that mainly coincide with one season or the other and tend to be different elsewhere. And what this is useful for is thinking a little bit about utility systems being able to sort of backstand each other. So in the case of the Florida utilities, they're in a good position to provide power, or to, excuse me, to provide power to the rest of the Southeast when it's peaking, because they're less likely to be peaking. And so they have an opportunity to sort of sell power out of the Southeast. The reverse is not really true because there's some transmission constraints on importing power into Florida, but that's something we'll cover a little bit later. So at any rate, this has been kind of an interesting way to look at it, and there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle that we can kind of draw out of this. So let me, at this point, I think I'm going to pass it back to Maggie for some closing thoughts.
All right. Thanks, John. So I'm going to wrap it up with some closing thoughts on the study and what kinds of further research could build off of this analysis. I want to give you all a quick reminder to type in questions in the using the Q&A function through Zoom, and we will get to those shortly. All right. So most of us are aware that the Southeast is not in what is called an organized market, as seen in other parts of the country where generation is competitive. Therefore, here, even more than in those other areas, the cost and reliability of power to the ultimate customer depends more heavily on the resource acquisition decisions of utilities, and as well as the opportunities that developers have for independent power development. These decisions are driven by peak demand forecasts, which are informed by historical trends in peak demand. And I want to reiterate that, as described in the second bullet on the screen, one thing we observed is that peak demand changed less than annual energy consumption over the last 20-year time period. This is important to keep in mind as we see individual peaks change from year to year, but that these do not necessarily represent a trend when we zoom out a bit and look at the overall data. One up year or down year can occur within the noise of the annual variability of overall peaks as well as seasonal peaks. We did want to point out that there are some observations we noticed when characterizing individual utilities as winter, summer, or dual peaking that are seen in the last bullet on this slide. There was some geographical correlation with all the summer peaking utilities being located in Florida and Georgia. We saw a trend that utilities that tend to be more rural appeared more likely to be more winter peaking, which John talked about, briefly already, and that this could be based on other factors other than just rural versus urban, and that's definitely an area for further study. This could also correlate to whether or not there's access to natural gas systems at the residential and or commercial level. So that's something to look in further. And finally, we found that utilities with higher commercial demand tended to be summer peaking utilities. All right, and then on the next slide. there's a few more thoughts. So reliability risk is driven by more than just having enough capacity to meet your peak plus a reserve margin. Thermal plants such as coal and nuclear provide less power during the summer. Transmission equipment is at a greater risk to fail during high temperatures, and that makes reliability, or those two factors make reliability risk likely higher during summer peak events than peak events in the wintertime that would be at that same magnitude. We also want to recognize that solar without supplemental storage has a profile that is poorly aligned with most winter peaks, except for some of those long duration winter peaks that we saw at a number of utilities. And with that, we'll end on a cautionary note. Utility trends do not necessarily match regional trends, and it's important for both planners and regulators to look at all of the data and not be misled by a recent up or down year that's not part of a statistically significant trend. All right, so now I'll move on to the final slide, which has email addresses for both John and I in case you want to follow up with both or either of us later, and we will start the Q&A. All right. Give me one moment to look this over. Okay. So first question comes from Chris Carmody on the overestimating. What arguments would Duke Energy, or I assume any utility, use about why they think they are more accurate, and what would be the counter argument? John, do you want to take this first one, and I'll take
Sure. Let me go back to that slide real quick.
Sure.
Oops. So there's a couple of things going on with the forecast issue. The first is that our forecast peak here is the total of all the utilities forecasts, and the actual peak is the coincident peak, which means that it's the peak that occurs on a particular hour. And so it may be that if you added up each utility's actual peak, that happened on a different day, like one utility had its top peak in January and another in August, and you added those two numbers together, you might come a little closer to the forecast peak. I do recall that we did that calculation just kind of to see what it said, and it was a little closer, but it was not. It didn't bring it up to a match on a trend. I think the utilities have been trying to improve their forecasts. I think that what they would say is that they're doing the best that they can. What we tend to see in some utility responses that I've seen, and not all the utilities that we're studying here have any kind of public process for reviewing their load forecast. But what we have heard them sometimes say is, well, we have to be careful not to underestimate the peak in our forecast, which is sort of a way of saying that even though the forecast is supposed to be a 50-50 forecast, it's supposed to be 50% chance the weather will be better, 50% chance the weather will be worse, and so we'll end up with, there's a higher peak and some years a lower peak. So they should end up on average matching their peak, but they tend to build in a little bit of cushion in their peak, which kind of double counts essentially the conservatism that you need in a reserve margin, which is supposed to account for unusual weather beyond the peak. So that's a fundamental problem that tends to come up in many utilities. I don't want to say all utilities, but certainly it's something I expect to see when I'm reviewing a load forecast report from a utility. Hopefully that answers the question as best as we can about that.
Yeah, I have one similar question that I think you generally addressed, but I'll go ahead and ask this one. I saw you had an analysis of peak load forecast errors for Southeast utilities. 2 questions. 1, did this analysis look at weather normalized actual loads or just raw load? And 2, did you do this analysis for individual utilities? And if so, are there any utilities that defy this trend, i.e. any utilities that are under forecasting their peaks? So anything to add, John, on that one?
So again, unless we're specifically referencing a forecast, all of our data in this study are actual historical hourly data, and then they may have been analyzed in some way. So we haven't done any weather normalization. The only thing that comes close to a weather normalization is when we take the year ahead forecast and, or excuse me, the year back forecast for the year. And that's an attempt to get sort of a measure of what the utility expected its peak would be in a particular year. This is the only slide where we really look at utility forecast further out than that 1 year look out. And this was simply a way to kind of put a lot of these peak numbers in context about what they mean relative to forecasts. And no, we did not do a systematic sort of triage of other utility by utility to see how they did on their forecasting. We certainly could do that with the data set that we have. We just simply, that wasn't the focus of this study. The focus was really much more on what's actually been going on with the utilities as opposed to their forecasts. And we'd have to really tease apart a study of utility forecasting practices. There's a lot more detail you'd need to have, and that would not be available uniformly across all the utilities in the Southeast. So it would be a pretty challenging study to do anything more than just simply gaze at the data and say, huh.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, John. I'll take the next question. We had 2 folks ask questions about how to think about, peak load forecasting and changes to peak load in the context of climate change. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. And I think that, yes, thank you. This was the slide I was thinking would be good to use for this one. I think that you can see here the orange line is the summer peaks for the region, and in a vacuum, if these summer peaks were only driven by weather and how hot it is in the summertime, we would expect this orange line to look pretty different. So I think it's pretty clear that there's other things going on. I think that, however, climate change definitely has the potential to impact future peak demand, and offset some other factors that are going on, whether those are, technological improvements, behavioral changes, a number of different factors within that.
Yeah, Maggie, I just add one other thing to that response. Let me jump to the summer load shape file. So here we see that the system load factor in the evening drops to basically 50%, whereas over 100% for Oglethorpe at a peak hour. And that's a pretty wide range. And one of the things that we know about climate change in the Southeast in particular is that nighttime temperatures are particularly being elevated more and more over time. Daytime temperatures are also going up, but it's really the differential between night and day that's being particularly squeezed. And so what you might expect to see is actually a flatter, maybe not flat, but a flatter load shape over the day in the summer. So you'd have more peak hours. You'd have the nighttime recovery down to a lower load would not be as prevalent. That would be my speculation on where things are likely to happen. We did not analyze that in this study. I don't think we have quite enough years of data to generate that kind of a result in any kind of a statistically meaningful way.
Yeah, thanks, John. That actually made me think of one more thing on this, which is that, you know, summer peak events and summer peak load shapes would be more likely to move into the shoulder months. So those are the months that are not, you know, technically considered summer in utility load forecasting typically, but that, you know, occur just before or just after summer. And so as it gets hotter earlier in the year, stays hotter later in the year. Okay, here we go. You can see the distribution of shoulder events here. And as we see, you know, as we see it get hotter earlier, stay hotter in later months, we can expect that, you know, we could expect more peaks during these shoulder months, either right before or right after summer. And one thing that you know could squeeze is that it could squeeze the time that utilities have for planned outages. A lot of times, because load is, you know, lower in the spring and fall, utilities use that time to take, you know, these large generation power plants offline, you know, do their annual maintenance on them, and we're already seeing that some of these timeframes are being squeezed.
Yeah, that's a great point, Maggie, and then you can pick that up here. If you look at the peak distribution, peak event distribution here for the shoulder months, you can see that most of the utilities with, say, 3, 4, maybe even 7% peak events in the shoulder months are in Florida. And of course, Florida has a much longer sort of hot season potentially. So that fits that thesis that you would expect to see the shoulder months begin to become more important from a peak hour perspective, and with the resulting impact on the utilities needing to think harder about their maintenance schedules for their thermal plants, that sort of thing. Great point.
All right. So we have a question from Shelley Robbins. The winter peaking difference between Santee Cooper and DEP and DEC is so strange given their geographic proximity. Any explanation why so much winter peaking for Santee Cooper? So I'll give this a brief response, and then John, you can chime in with anything else, which is that, you know, overall we saw less geographic trends than we expected. So there's clearly a lot of other factors going on. The only real geographic trends we saw were in Florida and Georgia, tended to have the more summer peaking utilities. But other than that, it was a mixed bag. There are other, you know, drivers of, you know, of these peaks. So it could be more of a local climate situation. It could be, you know, different technologies used. It could be different kinds of customers. These are some of the things that we looked at.
Yeah, that's absolutely the right answer, Maggie. The only thing I would point out, another example just on this chart, you can kind of see it pretty easily, is if you look in the summer peaking, you'll see Gainesville there. In the dual peaking, another urban municipal system just down the highway from Gainesville is Tallahassee, and then all the way up in the winter peaking group is JEA in Jacksonville, Florida, which is also, so they're all at roughly the same latitude, and they're not very far apart, and they're all mainly urban systems, but yet they have, each one has a very different characteristic in terms of its peaking characteristics. And so, you know, I think that the you know, there's several things you can take away from this study, but certainly that question highlights one of the most important ones, is to, you know, you can't necessarily sort of trust your intuition and reason by analogy from one utility to another, or as we've observed in some proceedings, they'll sort of take 1 year or 2 years of data and say, look what happened in this year or that year. And so you have to be afraid that that's going to happen, you know, year after year after year. And really the statistics and the underlying data require you to really look at it more objectively and think through it more carefully than that. What else we got, Maggie?
All right. So we have a good one from Kate Tracy. Is it reasonable to assume that utilities with more summer peaking will provide more capacity value to utility scale solar development in their service territory? I think reasonable, yes. Are they doing it? It depends. is the short answer to that one. You know, the summer load shapes we saw definitely did correlate more with a generation profile for solar, and so you could expect that they would have a higher capacity value in summer than in winter. We did see the potential for solar for some of the longer duration load events in the winter time, just because those tend to go long enough that they overlap with the native generation profile of solar, but that also doesn't consider pairing solar with storage, which makes it fit up with any number of these peak load profiles during peak events. All right. Let's see here. We have one from Dan York. Are you using this analysis to examine potential impacts of electrification, especially of home heating on winter peaks? Any insights on ability of existing system to meet changes? So we didn't look at, using this to look forward towards what this would mean in a case of high penetration of electrification for home heating, or high penetration of electrification of anything more generally. But that is definitely one place that us or others could take this study, and I think it would be an interesting thing to look at in the future, to see what that would mean for these peak trends. Do you want to add anything on that one, John?
I just think it's something that we've been interested in for years, and it's really challenging. I think this question was from Dan York. Dan, it's really challenging, as you know, to align a lot of the different energy resource data together, and really, so we have this electric load data at 22 utility system level, which means in some cases multiple states are covered by the data. And when you sort of think about electrification from, say, home heating, or maybe some other, something in the commercial sector, you really need to be very granular and be more at the county level, or even below that at the feeder level. And we just don't have those data. So this is, I think it would be really neat for some utilities to publicly disclose data that would allow you to get at that question. But it's going to be hard with the data sets that we have to really nail that. Certainly be interested to take on a project to try that, but it'd be challenging. What else do we have, Maggie?
All right. We have one from Thad Cully. What are the anticipated impacts of overall regional economic health on peak demand profiles? Do we have examples from the 2008 recession to give us insight on how the current downturn might impact 2020 IRP projections, or warrant adjustments to those projections? Is there a risk for solar value inherent in any recessionary adjustments, lower and later peaks? All right, a lot to unpack here. So I'll start out with saying that this study, these data were backward looking. So we have data through 2018, 20 years of data through 2018. And, so we're not looking at data, within the last year, or, for what's going on, economically right now, through the pandemic and having things be shut down. But we do have data from the recession. As you can see, we saw a dip. If you look at the slide on the current screen, we saw a dip in, starting in 2008, particularly for winter peaks for the region, but also a little bit of a dip in.
I think you mean for summer peaks.
For summer, thank you. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, this was one of the confounding things for me, was that the summer peaks did go down, but the winter peaks went up during that time frame. So it's really hard to isolate economic activity from weather activity in any particular year. And then you see after the recession really kicked in, the winter peaks began to drop way down while the summer peaks were kind of flatter. So it's and I do remember looking at this question a little bit on a utility by utility basis. Some utilities seem to show the effect on their peaks and their load at different points than others. So it's almost as if the recession happened from an electricity point of view, at least, at different dates and different utility service territories. That could have to do with different mixes between residential, commercial, and industrial customers, for example, in those different utilities. So there's a lot of factors going on that are challenging to tease out of that, and would require sort of focused study. And again, sort of the same answer, we may not even have enough data, even with these 22 utility data sets analyzed to answer that kind of a question, because it's so hard to disentangle the economy and the weather from these data. I'll go back to just these graphs here, and you can see how subtle the effect of the recession was on demand at many of these utilities. You don't see it like a huge drop, even though it did sort of show up in the national data, and certainly when you aggregate it, it kind of pops out a little bit more. But in many individual utilities didn't show too much change in their demand during that recession. I did see an article today that suggested that right now load is down around 5% across many utilities. I don't know how accurate that number is, but certainly if that is sustained over the whole year, that will be a much bigger impact than the recession.
Yeah, and I also think what we're seeing, what we're in the midst of right now is going to look different from the recession, just based on, I mean, it's a completely different situation, and we'll see different kinds of load react in different ways. We don't have any crystal ball on exactly how this is going to play out, but there's reason to think that residential load could go up, while commercial and industrial loads go down, and certain industrial or certain institutional loads are higher, and some are lower. And so I think that there's a lot of factors going on. I've seen too, the overall trend is going to be, is likely to be lower, but that what's going on within that overall trend, I think is still yet to be seen. All right. And we had a good comment too from Jim Wilson about the load forecasting that we talked about earlier, that a lot of that was due to over forecasting economic growth. I think that's relevant to what we're talking about here as well, because while we were going through the Great Recession, utilities were forecasting, well, next year load's going to be down, but then it'll turn the corner and shoot back up to 1 to 2% annual growth. And I think that you're absolutely right that that was driven by assumptions on on the economy.
Yeah, I would definitely, for anyone who's really interested in load forecast issues, Jim Wilson is one of the experts, one of the top experts on load forecasting. Very happy to have his comments here on the thread. And he, we did not get too much into critiquing load forecasting methods in the paper, and Jim has done a lot of that in testimony in Georgia and in the Carolinas, and I think also maybe in Alabama, if I remember correctly. So Jim's testimony is a really good place to look if you're interested in understanding sort of what is and isn't working with utility load forecasts.
All right, and we have one more comment from Chris Mathis saying that one reason the winter peaks went down is climate, that the 6 hottest years on record and 4 of the hottest winters on record were post 2008. I think that's a good point to keep in mind, that we're not talking about climate change just in the sense of summer peaks, but what is it doing to the winter as well. All right, folks. Well, we are just about at the hour. I think we got to all of the questions. So perfect timing on the questions, guys. And we will be sending around an email with the recording of this webinar to folks who joined and folks who registered and weren't able to join, as well as a link to the full report where you can read a little bit more about that, what we did and what the trends were, and dive deeper and look at even more beautiful charts and graphs and tables. And we also have our email addresses here on the screen, and those will be available in case you have any more questions. Thank you all for joining. Thanks for asking great questions, and have a great rest of your day.